Week 3. Identifying your thought patterns. In the previous chapter, you began to identify what you value in the major areas of your life, as well as activities that support each of these values. You then chose 3 activities to complete. This week, we'll start by reviewing how your activities went, then turn to identifying your thought patterns. And take a moment to review how your 3 activities went. What went well? What could have gone better? Write down your thoughts regarding Activity 1, Activity 2, Activity 3. What are your thoughts and feelings about planning and completing specific activities so far? A common response at this point in the program is, I did my activities, but I didn't feel any better. If that happened for you, well done. That means you stuck to your plan. If you did get a lift from doing the things you planned, that's great. Either way, keep going. This program is a lot like starting an exercise regimen. The first several workouts are going to be tough, and you won't feel a benefit right away. In the same way, adding a few activities is unlikely to make a big difference in the short term. If you keep at it, chances are you'll start to notice the difference. As you did last week, choose activities to complete in the coming week. Last week you planned 3. This week, pick 4 activities. You can repeat an activity from last week if you need to revisit it, but try to add some new ones. It takes practice to find activities that strike a balance between challenging and manageable. Stick with ones that you gave a ranking of 1, unless you're confident you can complete a 2. Write down the activities in a notebook. Activity 1. Activity 2. Activity 3. Activity 4. Keep in mind all the tips from last week as you plan your activities, including scheduling them into specific times in your week. Identifying thoughts with Neil. When Neil came to see me for the first time, he'd been out of work for 6 months. For 25 years, he'd done in-house IT work for a large financial firm, and he'd been let go as the markets contracted and the company tightened its belt. From the moment Neil was told to collect his things, he'd done everything right. He'd attended the outplacement service his firm paid for, he'd busied himself with networking and job applications, he'd made his employment search a full-time job. He was determined to treat being fired as an opportunity to find something better. Still, nobody hired him, even though several interviews had gone well. As his unemployment dragged on, Neil's enthusiasm began to flag. It got harder to get an early start on his day, and he felt like he was just going through the motions of his job search. But just before he called to schedule an initial visit, he received notice that his unemployment benefits would expire soon. Before the notice, he'd felt like he was hanging by a thread, and this last blow felt enormously stressful and depressing all at once. He was 52 years old and had financial commitments to his young adult children, to help his daughter, a recent college grad, pay her rent, and paying for his son's college tuition. With 10 years left to pay on his mortgage, the financial stress was overwhelming. His wife was extremely supportive and good at encouraging him to do what he needed to do. At the same time, Neil knew he could lean on her only so much, since she had stresses and a full-time job of her own. He knew he was really struggling when he had a passing thought. Maybe the wife and kids would be better off if I were dead so they'd get the life insurance money. He called me the same day. Neil's positive traits were easy to appreciate. He was committed first and foremost to his family, and he couldn't stand the thought that he might not be able to provide for them as he always had. I could see that he strongly resisted the downward pull of his situation, trying to stay upbeat, but as my initial evaluation went on, I could see his defenses breaking down. When I asked him about his job search, he concluded by saying with a half smile, "I guess no one wants to hire an old man." In the first couple of weeks of his treatment, Neil and I focused on getting him active again. His job search activities were a big part of his activity plan, of course, as was physical exercise and making time for enjoyable downtime, which he'd mostly given up because he didn't think he deserved it. As he worked through his activities, it became clear that powerful thoughts and assumptions were getting in his way. We would need to address his thinking head-on. Review of cognitive approach. Many of our emotional reactions come from how we think about things that happen. As humans, we want to understand our world. so we create stories to explain events. For example, if a friend is upset with us, we might believe that this friend is prone to being irrational and has no real reason to be mad. If we believe that story, we might feel some irritation toward this friend. We could diagram the sequence like this. Friend is upset with me, leads to he's being irrational again, leads to irritated at friend. What if you assume that your friend must be mad for a reason and that it's your fault? You're likely to feel different emotions. Friend is upset with me leads to I'm a lousy friend, leads to worried, guilty. A major challenge in understanding the thoughts that drive our own emotions is that they don't often announce themselves. Although we're bothered by our interpretation of an event, we think we're bothered by the event per se. What we usually experience is an event causing an emotion. Friend is upset with me leads to irritated at friend, or friend is upset with me leads to worried, guilty. As a result, we don't have the opportunity to ask if the thoughts make sense because we don't even recognize that we had a thought. It's hard to evaluate thoughts that we don't recognize as thoughts. For this reason, we need to practice recognizing our thoughts and beliefs. This practice is important enough that we'll devote the rest of this chapter to it. You might notice some changes in your thought process simply from becoming more aware of what your mind is telling you. There's something about writing down our thoughts that can begin to change our relationship with them. When I notice that I'm telling myself things, I can see that those things may or may not be true. How to identify thoughts. In an early session with Neil, he described a disappointing rejection from another company. When I asked him to talk more about what was disappointing, he replied, "It's just frustrating to still not have a job, you know? I think anyone would be disappointed at this point." Neil had a great point. It's not as though the things that were happening to him were positive events he was somehow twisting into negative events. It's inherently stressful to have financial responsibilities and be struggling to find work. At the same time, each of us responds differently to this experience. We needed to identify exactly what Neil's reactions were. I asked Neil to relax and close his eyes, and to imagine where he was when he got the news that he hadn't gotten the job. Then I asked him to recount the conversation with the hiring manager, which he did, and I directed him to pay attention to how he felt. What emotions was he aware of? Did he notice any sensations in his body? Did any thoughts go through his mind? Neil opened his eyes and said, "Yes. Why would anyone hire me?" That's the thought I had. I encouraged him to consider if there were an implicit answer to that question. "Well, I meant it rhetorically," he said. "What I meant was nobody would hire me." As we continued talking, Neil told me that he saw himself as outmoded, like a dinosaur. "I see all these recent college grads," he told me, "and they're my daughter's age, and we're interviewing for the same jobs. What hope does a gray-haired guy with bifocals have against these kids?" Now, it was easy to see what was so disappointing about this rejection. Not only did he not get this job, but he told himself that there was something unchangeable about him, his age, that would prevent him from getting any job. He was telling himself things like, "I shouldn't even waste my time. This is pointless." No wonder he was investing less in his job search, since it all seemed like wasted energy. Take a few moments to think about a recent situation in which you felt a surge of unpleasant emotion. Think about where you were at the time and what was happening. Picture it as vividly as possible. Now briefly describe the event that led up to the change in mood. Also describe the emotion or emotions you felt. Notice any thoughts you had at the time. Can you identify specific thoughts that could explain the resulting emotion? Write down your observations in a notebook. As you consider your own thoughts related to anxiety and depression, notice what time period the thoughts focus on. Some probably deal with explanations of things that have happened already. Others may be about future events, predictions of what could happen. Still others may be about what's happening right now. As you try to identify your thoughts, keep in mind that they could be about the past, present, or future. Sometimes thoughts come as an image or an impression. Rather than thinking, "I'm weak," for example, we might have an image of ourselves as being small and powerless. When you're practicing identifying your thoughts, remember that they may or may not be in the form of words. We can diagram the event, thoughts, and emotions from an episode. Refer to Neil's diagram for the recent job rejection in the bonus material. Think of a time when something happened in your own life that led you to feeling down or depressed. What thoughts went through your mind? Use the diagram in the bonus materials to illustrate this example. What if I can't identify a thought? With other events that we looked at in retrospect, Neil didn't know what his thoughts were. "It's funny," he said, "but before we talked about these things, I didn't even really think I was thinking. I just took the way I saw the world as fact. I'm still working on recognizing what my thoughts are." For these episodes, we left a placeholder. We would need to gather more information from new events to get a clearer understanding of his thinking. A lot of times, it's hard to know exactly what we were thinking if we're not actually in the moment when we had the thought. If you weren't able to pinpoint a thought that led to an emotion, don't worry. You'll have plenty of opportunities to practice. In truth, learning to hear what we're telling ourselves is a skill we can refine throughout our lives. This is just the beginning. One part of your activity plan for this week will be to record at least 3 instances when your mood dipped. You'll simply note what was happening, what you felt, and what thought or thoughts you had. You can record these episodes on the Identifying Thoughts form. Common themes in anxiety and depression. As Neil got to know his thoughts better, he recognized a familiar cast of characters. Most of his disturbing thoughts were about his hopeless future, which he believed was a result of his old age, and obsolescence, which he took to mean he wouldn't be able to provide for his family, which he thought made him a worthless human being. No wonder Neil was depressed. He was constantly bombarded with thoughts about being old, unwanted, and useless. As you record your own thoughts and emotions over the coming week, chances are you'll begin to notice recurring themes. It's like our mind is a jukebox and only has a few hits to play over and over when a triggering event pushes the button. Our individual experiences of anxiety and depression will be closely related to the kinds of thoughts we often have. Let's consider some common types of thoughts that come up in certain psychological conditions. We'll start with the anxiety disorders. You can skip the exercises for conditions that don't apply to you. Specific phobia. When we're afraid of something, we often believe it's dangerous. If we have a fear of flying, we might think mysterious noises on a plane indicate something's wrong. 2 people might experience the same event in completely different ways depending on their interpretation. When the plane's nose dips, you may be terrified if you think it means the engines have failed and the plane is going down fast. If you think, "Oh, good, we've started our descent," you'll feel very different emotions. Think about any of your own fears and a recent time your fear was triggered. Are you aware of any thought that came up that may have contributed to your fear? Panic. Panic is fueled by beliefs that some horrible crisis is imminent if we don't escape from or change the situation immediately. I once had an episode of derealization in which my office felt strangely unfamiliar. I suddenly knew something was dreadfully wrong and that I must be having a stroke or some other medical emergency. I went outside, believing I needed to be somewhere public in case I lost consciousness. Once I got outside and started feeling better, it dawned on me that I'd had a panic attack, fueled by my perception of danger translating into a weird sensation of unreality. Other common beliefs in panic disorder include, if I panic while driving, I'll crash the car. If my panic attack gets bad enough, I'll faint. Everyone will know I'm panicking and I'll embarrass myself. If I panic, I might lose control and attack someone. Panic will make me lose my vision, which could be really dangerous. If I don't stop panicking, I'm going to go crazy. I'm having a heart attack. I might not get enough air and suffocate from a panic attack. I'm going to have sudden diarrhea if I panic at the wrong time. If you struggle with panic, think about specific times you've had a panic attack. What triggered the attack? Did you interpret the trigger in a way that led to more fear and more panic? Social anxiety disorder. The driving thought in social anxiety disorder is that you'll do something to embarrass yourself around other people. If we're prone to social anxiety, we're likely to make the most negative possible interpretation of things that happen in social settings. One big challenge in social anxiety disorder is that we're often afraid that others will know we're anxious. They'll see I'm blushing and think I'm an idiot for being embarrassed, we might tell ourselves, or we might think, if my voice shakes, they'll lose all confidence in me. The anxiety about appearing anxious tends to heighten our anxiety, leading to a vicious cycle. If you experience a lot of social anxiety, think about a recent situation in which you feared others' judgments. Can you identify thoughts about what might happen in this situation? Generalized anxiety disorder, GAD. Thinking tends to be a very prominent part of GAD. The thoughts often start with what if about something bad that could happen. What if I fail this exam? What if my headache means I have a brain tumor? What if something happens to my parents? What if I lose my job? What if the stock market tanks and wipes out my retirement savings? Because it's generalized, the worry in GAD can attach to anything. There also tends to be an implicit belief that I need to do something to make sure this bad thing doesn't happen. We feel like it's our responsibility to control the situation, whatever it may be. We might tell ourselves we have to make sure that doesn't happen, and so we'll do some mental activity, worrying, to try to work through the problem, but unproductively. It's like trying to play an entire chess game in advance, not knowing the other player's moves, but still trying to solve the upcoming game. Unfortunately, the things we worry about typically aren't completely under our control. Can we be absolutely certain we won't fail an exam, have a medical crisis, lose someone close to us, and so forth? So we find ourselves caught in a thinking loop. From what if, we try to think of a solution that makes sure what we're afraid of doesn't happen. Since we can't have the certainty we seek, we're back to what if. For example, we might worry about our kids' safety. What if they get badly hurt at camp? We run through a list of bad things that might happen and try to reassure ourselves that our children will be fine, but of course we can't know they'll really be safe, so our minds go back to what if, and the loop continues. A person with GAD may also believe that worrying is a useful exercise. We might think, for example, that if we worry about something, we can prevent it from happening, and so to stop worrying would be to let down our guard. It's easy to believe our worrying works if we're always worrying, and what we've worried about hasn't happened. Maybe it's because we worried. Or we might believe that our constant worrying says something good about us, that we care. If you see yourself as someone who worries too much, think about a recent situation that triggered anxiety. What was the situation, and can you identify any thoughts that led to your distress? Fear of fear. It's not hard to understand thoughts about situations or objects we believe are dangerous. Our fear is tied to our belief about the danger. But what about situations or objects we know aren't really dangerous, but we still avoid and are afraid of? Often we are afraid of our own fear. We may think it's dangerous to be extremely afraid, and that something catastrophic might happen if we become too frightened. Maybe we think we'll have a heart attack or a stroke. We might also believe that our fear will last forever if we confront what we're afraid of. Not uncommonly, we fear we'll lose it or go crazy from being too afraid. We may believe on some level that if we get too terrified, we can reach a place that's beyond fear, some qualitatively different experience that's worse than bad. Maybe we think we'll get so freaked out that we won't be able to stand it and we'll do something embarrassing. Think about your own experiences of fear and anxiety. Are there things you're afraid of even though you know they aren't dangerous? Think as carefully as you can about how you feel when confronted with the object or situation. Do you have any predictions about what will happen as a result of being terrified? Common themes in depression. Neil got a second interview at a company that seemed like a good fit for him. Then a curious thing started to happen. He began to assume that there must be something wrong with the company, because why else would they want to hire him? He felt ashamed when he told his wife about the interview. He wasn't even going to tell her about it, but she asked where his interview was when she saw he'd set out his suit. Neil and I worked together to understand his thought process. He discovered he was telling himself the company must be really desperate to hire someone if they were still interested in him after knowing his age. As a result, he told himself he was pathetic for interviewing with the company. When we're depressed, We often see any disappointing event as evidence of our own failure. Sometimes we even turn positive events into negative ones. Depressed thinking can turn even a win into a loss. Common thoughts in depression center around themes of being less than in some way. Examples include, I'm weak, I'm a loser, no one could really love someone like me, I mess up everything. Hopelessness is another common theme in depressed thinking, and it leads to an attitude of why bother. If nothing we do makes things better, we reason, why waste our energy trying to change things? This kind of thinking can feed itself, since it leads to inactivity, continued low mood, and an ongoing belief that things will never improve. If you're going through depression, think of a recent time something really brought down your mood. What did you tell yourself about what happened? Maybe even while reading this chapter, you've had depression-fueled thoughts such as, this probably won't work for me, or what's the point? I know my thoughts don't make sense. Nothing can help me. Take some time to record what happened and what thoughts you can recall. Getting to the core. Over time, Neil noticed that all of his thoughts shared a final destination. If he traced where all the thoughts led, he discovered that they all ended with his being useless and pathetic. He even had an image in his mind that went along with this notion. He pictured a worn-out washcloth that had been dropped between the washer and dryer, and nobody bothers to pick it up. To see how he diagrammed his thoughts, refer to Neil's core belief diagram in the bonus materials. The central thought or image reflects what Aaron Beck and others call a core belief, with the specific thoughts all coming from and strengthening this central belief. Believing that I'm generally useless and pathetic leads to more specific thoughts that are related to my core belief. Those specific thoughts are taken as evidence supporting my core belief. Without identifying and checking these thoughts, the cycle continues. We find a similar phenomenon with anxiety, which is our core fear, or the big fear that drives our smaller fears. If I have a core fear of dying and abandoning my kids, for example, I may be extremely anxious about getting sick, traveling, and safety in the home. You may have an inkling at this point about what your core beliefs and fears are, or maybe you have no idea yet. Over the coming days and weeks, you'll be gathering information that will help you identify your core beliefs and fears. Once we've pinpointed these central issues, we can work more efficiently, recognizing that it's basically the same message our mind keeps sending us. Practice for this week. In the coming week, pay attention to times when you notice a worsening in your mood. As close in time to the event as possible, ideally in real time, see if you can catch the thoughts that are feeding your emotions. Keep the identifying thoughts form on hand so you can complete them as soon as possible. Next week, we'll use what you come up with to begin breaking away from these thought patterns. Chapter Check-in. In this chapter, you took another important step. You began to figure out some of your thoughts that lead you to anxiety and depression. I encourage you to treat any progress you make this week as a success. Most of us have to work hard to discover our underlying thoughts, so if you find it isn't easy, you're in good company. Stick with it. You are also continuing the work you started last week of adding valued activities into your schedule. Take some time to think about how you're feeling at this point. Write down your thoughts and feelings along with any questions in a notebook. I'll see you in week 4. Activity plan. 1. Complete the 4 activities you planned for this week. 2. Complete the identifying thoughts form for at least 3 events. 3. Plan a time now to return to complete week 4.